New York City, once a bustling metropolis, now lay in ruins under the weight of a relentless nightmare. Skyscrapers that once touched the sky now stood as broken sentinels, their shattered windows reflecting a somber gray light. The scent of decay lingered in the air, mingling with the distant moans of the undead that echoed through the shattered streets. My family and I huddled in a dimly lit apartment, our fear-laden whispers barely audible amidst the cacophony of the city's decay. The pale light of our flickering candle cast dancing shadows across our faces as we clung to each other, trying to find solace in a world that had been transformed into a living hell. Lily, my daughter, looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Mom, when is this going to end?" Her voice trembled as she voiced the question that had been haunting us all. I held her close, my heart heavy with the weight of uncertainty. "I don't know, sweetheart. We're doing our best to stay safe." Mark, my husband, stood by the window, his eyes fixed on the outside world as he scanned the city's remnants through binoculars. "We can't stay here forever," he said, his voice a mixture of desperation and determination. "We need to find a way out of the city." His words echoed the thoughts that had been swirling in all our minds. The news had been filled with reports of quarantine zones and evacuation centers, but reaching them was a treacherous journey through streets infested with the undead. As night fell, the city's twisted landscape grew even more sinister. The moans of the zombies outside grew louder, a chilling symphony that sent shivers down our spines. We huddled together, the darkness outside punctuated only by the occasional flicker of distant fires. The undead lurked in the shadows, their presence a constant reminder that death had taken hold of our world. Hours stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. The sounds of our fearful whispers blended with the distant cries of the undead, creating an eerie symphony that encapsulated the city's desolation. The minutes crawled as we waited, held captive by fear and uncertainty. Then a crash shattered the stillness, followed by the sound of shuffling footsteps outside our door. My heart raced, and the room seemed to close in around us as we exchanged fearful glances. The barricade we had constructed using furniture and whatever we could find trembled under the force of the pressure from the other side. "Mom, what's happening?" Lily's voice quivered as she clung to me, her fear mirrored in all our faces. Mark gripped a metal pipe, his knuckles white with tension. "We fight," he declared, his voice unwavering. "We can't let them in." With a shared nod, we armed ourselves with makeshift weapons and prepared for the inevitable confrontation. The shuffling footsteps grew closer, the barricade straining against the onslaught. With a deafening crash, the barricade gave way. The door burst open, and the room was flooded with the pale light of the moon and the stench of death. The undead surged into the room, their lifeless eyes fixed on us, their outstretched arms grasping for our flesh. We fought with a ferocity born of desperation, our weapons swinging and striking as we pushed back against the relentless horde. The room became a battlefield of survival, the sound of impact and the groans of the undead blending into a nightmarish symphony. The minutes stretched into an eternity as we fought to hold our ground. Sweat dripped down our faces, our muscles aching from the effort, but we refused to yield. We couldn't afford to lose, not when our lives hung in the balance. And then, just as it seemed that the room was closing in on us, a deafening roar cut through the chaos. The horde hesitated, their rotting faces turning towards the broken window. Through the shattered glass, a group of survivors appeared, armed with weapons and resolve. They opened fire, the sound of gunshots reverberating through the room. The undead fell one by one, their bodies crumpling to the ground as the survivors' onslaught cut through the darkness. As the last of the zombies lay motionless, the survivors entered the room, their faces a mix of exhaustion and relief. They introduced themselves as a makeshift group that had banded together in the face of the apocalypse. "We've been clearing buildings, creating safe zones," their leader explained, his voice a testament to his determination. "You're not alone in this fight." We looked around at the room, the aftermath of our battle strewn across the floor. It was a somber reminder of the horrors we faced, but also a symbol of our resilience. As we joined forces with the survivors, stepping out into the ruined city, we knew that our journey was far from over. The streets of New York had become a battleground, and as we ventured forth, united by our shared purpose, we carried with us a flicker of hope in a world consumed by darkness. The survivors who had rescued us led us through the twisted streets of the decaying city. Every corner turned, every alleyway crossed, was a potential danger, a reminder that the undead could emerge from the shadows at any moment. The once familiar landmarks of New York City were now haunting monuments of the apocalypse. As we moved, our group exchanged stories of survival, our voices a mixture of weariness and determination. The leader, Jack, shared his experience of witnessing the outbreak unfold, the rapid transformation of the city into a hunting ground for the undead. Others recounted close calls and the losses they had suffered, the pain etched in their eyes. "We're heading towards an evacuation center," Jack explained, his voice echoing in the empty streets. "It's our best shot at finding safety and regrouping." The idea of a safe haven felt like a glimmer of hope in a world gone mad. We followed our new companions with a shared sense of purpose, navigating through the wreckage and avoiding open spaces that might expose us to danger. Hours turned into an exhausting journey, the city's silence broken only by the distant sounds of gunfire and the occasional guttural growl of the undead. We moved as a tightly knit group, our senses alert for any signs of movement or threat. At one point, we reached a makeshift barricade manned by survivors armed with weapons. They regarded us with caution, their eyes scanning our group for any sign of danger. After a tense exchange of words, they allowed us to pass through, providing directions and a warning about the challenges that lay ahead. The sun was beginning to set as we entered Central Park, its once lush foliage now a tangled maze of darkness. We moved through the park with a sense of urgency, knowing that the cover of night would bring even greater dangers. It was then that we heard it, a low growl that sent shivers down our spines. We froze in our tracks, weapons at the ready, as a group of zombies emerged from the shadows. Their eyes glowed with an insatiable hunger, their movements synchronized and relentless. With a surge of adrenaline, we fought back, our weapons striking true as we pushed against the horde. The battle was fierce, the sound of gunfire and the sickening thud of impact filling the air. Our group moved in harmony, each member watching the other's back as we faced the unending onslaught. Amidst the chaos, I caught glimpses of Lily, her face a mask of determination as she swung a metal pipe. Mark fought alongside her, his every move calculated and precise. We were a united front, a family forged in the fires of adversity. The battle raged on, the intensity of the struggle threatening to consume us. It felt as if time itself had lost all meaning, the minutes blending into a blur of instinct and survival. We were driven by a primal need to protect one another, to survive the nightmarish ordeal we found ourselves in. And then, as it seemed that the tide of the battle was turning against us, a new group of survivors arrived on the scene. Their arrival was a turning point, their firepower and determination shifting the balance in our favor. The horde was gradually pushed back, their numbers dwindling as the combined efforts of our groups proved effective. As the last of the zombies fell to the ground, the survivors caught their breath, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and relief. We looked around at the faces that had joined us in battle, united by a shared fight for survival. Each one had a story, a journey through the darkness that had led them to this moment. Jack nodded in approval, a grim smile forming on his lips. "We've managed to secure this area," he said, his voice carrying a newfound sense of hope. "It's not much, but it's a foothold in this chaos." As we exchanged introductions and shared our stories, it became clear that we were not alone in our struggle. The city's survivors had banded together, creating pockets of resistance amidst the chaos. The bonds we formed in this apocalyptic landscape were forged by shared hardship, an unbreakable connection that transcended the challenges we faced. With the survivors' guidance, we continued our journey through the city, the destination of the evacuation center within reach. The road ahead was still fraught with danger, but our newfound allies and shared determination gave us strength. As we walked through the ruined streets, I looked back at the skyline, the shattered remnants of buildings that had once defined the city's majesty. The world had changed, and yet, as we walked forward into the unknown, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey was far from over, and the dangers ahead were undeniable, but together, we would navigate the darkness, driven by the promise of safety and the unbreakable bonds that had formed amidst the chaos. The survivors had decided to regroup and secure their surroundings before continuing their journey to the evacuation center. Our new allies had experience in navigating the city's treacherous landscape, and together we formed a plan for a supply run. A risky venture into the heart of the undead-infested ruins to gather much-needed resources. As the sun cast long shadows across the desolate streets, we gathered in the dimly lit apartment that had become our temporary refuge. Maps were spread out on a makeshift table, illuminated by the soft glow of candles. Jack, the leader of the survivors, outlined the plan with a stern yet composed demeanor. "We need food, water, medical supplies, and ammunition," he began, his voice carrying the weight of the task ahead. "We'll divide into teams and search nearby buildings. Stay alert, move quietly, and only engage if absolutely necessary." The room was filled with a tense silence as everyone absorbed the gravity of the mission. Lily clutched my hand, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. Mark gripped his weapon, his jaw set in grim resolve. This was our chance to contribute, to prove that we were capable of surviving in this new world. The survivors split into teams, each assigned a specific area to scavenge. Mark, Lily, and I joined a group tasked with exploring a nearby grocery store. The air was thick with tension as we slipped out of the building, our footsteps muffled by the debris underfoot. The streets were eerily quiet. The lingering scent of decay, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked around every corner. We moved in a tight formation, our senses heightened as we navigated through the ruins. The broken storefronts and shattered glass were a testament to the chaos that had consumed the city. The grocery store loomed ahead, its windows boarded up but its entrance still accessible. Mark motioned for us to approach cautiously, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of movement. With a nod, we entered the store, the interior shrouded in darkness. The beam of our flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing aisles of overturned shelves and scattered debris. The store had been picked clean by previous scavengers, but we remained hopeful that we might find something of value. We split up, each of us searching different sections of the store. My heart raced as I moved down the aisles, my footsteps careful and deliberate. The sound of our breathing was a constant reminder that we were not alone, that the undead could be lurking just beyond the reach of the light. I came across a shelf that still held a few cans of food, their labels faded but still recognizable. With a sense of relief, I gathered them into a bag, grateful for any sustenance we could find. As I turned to continue my search, a noise in the distance made me freeze in place. A low growl echoed through the store, followed by the shuffling of footsteps. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, my flashlight beam dancing over the aisles. And then I saw it. A zombie. Its pallid skin and vacant eyes a stark contrast to the darkness around it. My mind raced as I backed away slowly, my breath caught in my throat. I needed to warn the others, to avoid attracting the attention of more undead. I retreated carefully, my steps silent as I returned to where Mark and Lily were searching. With a hushed voice, I whispered to them about the zombie I had encountered. Mark nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of caution and determination. We regrouped and made our way back to the entrance, hoping to avoid a confrontation with the undead. As we stepped out of the store, the tension in the air was palpable. The streets were no longer empty. A group of zombies had gathered, drawn by the sound of our movements. We shared a tense glance, realizing that we needed to navigate through the horde to make it back to safety. With our weapons at the ready, we moved as one, using every ounce of stealth and strategy to avoid detection. The undead were relentless, their groans and shuffling footsteps a haunting symphony that echoed through the streets. We moved slowly, each step calculated, our breath held as we slipped through the gaps in the horde. The tension was suffocating as we made our way back to the apartment. Every noise, every movement threatened to give away our position, and the weight of the moment bore down on us. But our determination carried us forward, the shared goal of returning to safety fueling our every step. Finally, we reached the apartment building, our hearts pounding in our chests. We slipped inside and secured the entrance behind us, the sound of the undead's frustrated groans fading into the distance. We had survived the supply run, a small victory in the face of overwhelming odds. As we gathered together, our faces illuminated by the dim candlelight, we counted our meager spoils, a few cans of food, a bottle of water, and a handful of medical supplies. It wasn't much, but it was a testament to our resilience and resourcefulness. Jack's voice broke the silence. "We did well," he said, his gaze meeting each of ours. "We'll continue to gather supplies and fortify our position. It won't be easy, but we're in this together." As we settled in for the night, the weight of the world outside seemed momentarily lighter. We had faced the dangers of the city head-on, proving that even in the midst of the apocalypse, humanity's spirit could endure. The road ahead was uncertain. But as we huddled together in the dimly lit apartment, we knew that as long as we had each other, we had a chance to survive amidst the shadows of the undead-infested world. Winter had descended upon the city, casting a frigid blanket of snow over the decaying landscape. The survivors had managed to secure their temporary refuge and gather limited supplies, but the impending snowstorm added a new layer of uncertainty to their struggle for survival. The bitter cold posed a threat as dangerous as the undead themselves. As the first snowflakes fell from the sky, the survivors huddled together in the dimly lit apartment. The soft glow of candles danced across our faces, a flickering reminder of the warmth we desperately clung to. The howling wind outside served as a chilling harbinger of the storm's fury. "We need to reinforce our defenses," Jack declared, his voice cutting through the air. "The cold won't just affect us. It'll slow down the undead as well. But we can't let our guard down." The room was tense as we set to work, fortifying the windows and barricading the entrance with whatever materials we could find. The wind rattled the window panes, and the temperature continued to drop, a reminder that survival meant more than just staying hidden from the undead. As the storm intensified, we settled in for a long and restless night. The eerie silence outside was occasionally broken by the distant groans of the undead, their movements hindered by the snow that blanketed the streets. We clung to each other for warmth, our breath visible in the cold air. It was during the darkest hours of the night that a sudden crash shattered the stillness. We jolted awake, our hearts pounding as we exchanged fearful glances. The barricade at the entrance had been breached, and with weapons in hand, we moved silently through the apartment, our eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of movement. The wind howled outside, masking any potential threats with its haunting symphony. And then, we saw them. Figures silhouetted against the dim light filtering in from the broken windows. Intruders had entered our refuge, drawn by the promise of shelter from the storm. "Who are you?" Mark's voice was sharp, his weapon held steady as he confronted the strangers. The leader of the group stepped forward, his eyes wary but not hostile. "We're survivors," he said, his voice carrying a mix of weariness and desperation. "We were trying to find shelter from the storm." Tensions hung heavy in the air as we regarded the newcomers. The shared struggle for survival had brought us together. But trust was a scarce commodity in a world overrun by the undead. Jack stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "You need to understand that our priority is the safety of our group," he said, his words laced with caution. "We can't risk letting strangers into our refuge without knowing more about you." The strangers nodded in understanding, their faces etched with weariness. They explained their own journey, the challenges they had faced, and the losses they had suffered. The story was all too familiar, a desperate search for safety in a world that had been consumed by chaos. After a tense exchange, we reached a tentative agreement. The newcomers would be allowed to stay temporarily, under close watch. We had survived this long by trusting our instincts, and this decision was no different. As the storm raged on outside, the apartment became a refuge for both groups. The tension between us gradually eased as we shared stories of our struggles, our shared fears and hopes bridging the gap that had initially divided us. Days turned into nights, the snowstorm showing no signs of abating. Together, we weathered the cold, sharing resources and working to keep the barricades secure. The presence of the newcomers added a new layer of complexity to our daily routines, but it also strengthened our collective resolve to survive. As the snow began to melt and the storm finally subsided, the survivors faced a choice: to continue as a united group or part ways and seek their own paths. The bond that had formed during the storm was undeniable. a testament to the shared experiences that had forged a fragile sense of community. In the end, we chose to stay together, to face the challenges of this new world as a united front. The city was a frozen wasteland, but amidst the chilling winds and the haunting groans of the undead, we found a glimmer of warmth in the bonds of trust and camaraderie that had been forged in the crucible of survival. The days following the snowstorm were filled with a fragile sense of unity as our combined group worked to strengthen our defenses and scavenge for supplies. The strangers who had sought refuge with us had slowly integrated into our routines, sharing the burden of survival. But as the weeks passed, tensions began to simmer beneath the surface, threatening to fracture the fragile bonds that had formed. It was a seemingly insignificant incident that sparked the first flicker of discord. Supplies had grown scarce, and the pressure of living in such close quarters was taking its toll on everyone's patience. One evening, an argument escalated into a heated exchange between one of the newcomers and a member of our original group. I watched as voices were raised and accusations flew, the room growing tense with hostility. Mark and Jack attempted to mediate, their voices calm but firm. But the damage was done. A rift had formed, and the trust that had been painstakingly built was now threatened. As the argument escalated, the sense of unease was palpable. It was then that a loud crash from outside shattered the growing tension. We rushed to the windows, our eyes widening in horror as we witnessed the cause of the commotion. The argument had drawn the attention of the undead. Undead figures emerged from the shadows, their numbers growing rapidly as they converged on the building. Panic spread through our ranks as we realized the gravity of the situation. The noise had attracted a mob of hungry, relentless undead, and they were closing in on our refuge. "We need to secure the barricades!" Jack's voice rang out, snapping us into action. Weapons were grabbed, and furniture was hastily pushed against the doors and windows. Adrenaline surged through our veins as we fought to fortify our defenses, but the undead were relentless, their moans a haunting chorus that echoed through the air. The sound was like a siren's call, drawing more of the undead to the scene. Our makeshift barricades strained under the force of their relentless onslaught. Amidst the chaos, the argument that had ignited the confrontation seemed insignificant. Survival was now the only goal, as we fought desperately to hold back the horde that pressed against our defenses. Lily's terrified gaze met mine, and I could see the fear in her eyes. This was a battle unlike any we had faced before. A battle against not only the undead, but also the very divisions that threatened to tear us apart. The apartment became a battleground, a symphony of groans, gunshots, and the clash of weapons against the figures that moved with a macabre purpose. We fought with a desperation born of survival, each strike and shot a reminder of the stakes that had been raised by the arrival of the mob. As the minutes stretched into an eternity, it became clear that our defenses were failing. The barricades splintered under the force of the undead, their insatiable hunger driving them forward. Our weapons grew heavy in our hands as fatigue set in, our movements becoming slower and more labored. It was then that a realization struck me. The strangers who had become part of our group were fighting alongside us. The rift that had divided us was now irrelevant in the face of the shared threat. In this moment, survival was the common thread that bound us together. With renewed determination, we fought back against the horde, our collective efforts finally stemming the tide of the figures that moved relentlessly. The survivors' resilience shone through, and even in the midst of chaos, a sense of unity emerged. As the last of the figures fell to the ground, the room was filled with the heavy silence of victory. We were battered, bruised, and exhausted, but we were still standing. The apartment was in shambles, the aftermath of the battle a stark reminder of the dangers that surrounded us. With a mixture of exhaustion and relief, we looked around at each other. The strangers who had once been seen as unwelcome guests were now part of our collective struggle. The fight had tested our bonds, but it had also reinforced the truth that survival was possible only through cooperation and trust. As we caught our breath, we knew that the challenges ahead were far from over. The city remained a perilous landscape, and the undead were an ever-present threat. But in the wake of the battle, a new understanding had emerged. That unity was our greatest weapon, and the bonds we had forged were the key to enduring the relentless nightmare that had become our reality. The city had become a battleground, its streets marred by the remnants of its former glory. Our group of survivors had weathered countless trials, united by the common goal of survival. As the days turned into weeks, a growing sense of urgency hung in the air. The undead horde was relentless, and our resources were dwindling. We gathered in the dimly lit apartment, our faces reflecting a mix of weariness and determination. The tension was palpable as we discussed our options, weighing the risks and rewards of every possible course of action. Jack's voice was resolute as he addressed the group. "We can't stay here indefinitely," he said, his gaze sweeping over each of us. "The city's resources are running out, and the undead are closing in. We need to find a way out." The weight of his words settled over us, a reminder that the battle for survival had reached a critical juncture. It was then that Mark spoke up, his voice carrying a mixture of determination and desperation. "There's a way to signal for help," he said, his eyes meeting ours with a glimmer of hope. "There's a radio tower on top of a partially destroyed skyscraper. If we can get there and send out a distress signal, maybe someone will come." The idea of rescue was a spark of light in the darkness that had become our reality. We agreed that it was worth the risk, that anything was better than remaining trapped in a city overrun by the undead. The decision was made. We would make our way to the radio tower and send out a signal in a final bid for salvation. The journey through the city was treacherous, the undead a constant threat as we moved cautiously through the ruins. The streets were littered with debris, the remnants of buildings serving as grim reminders of the world that had been lost. Our group moved as a tightly knit unit, our senses alert for any sign of danger. Finally, we reached the partially destroyed skyscraper, its skeletal frame a stark contrast to the surrounding destruction. With weapons at the ready, we began the ascent, climbing higher and higher as the wind howled around us. The tower was unstable, its structure a precarious reminder of the world's downfall. At last, we reached the top, the radio equipment a glimmer of hope amidst the chaos. Mark worked quickly, his fingers flying over the buttons as he attempted to establish a connection. The tension was palpable as we waited, the static-filled silence a reminder of the uncertainty that hung in the air. And then, a crackling voice broke through the static, a voice of hope and salvation. The military had received our distress signal and was mobilizing forces to enter the city and combat the undead threat. Relief washed over us, a sense of renewal in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. But as we descended from the tower, the sky above us darkened with an ominous promise. The horizon was streaked with trails of smoke, and the distant roar of engines filled the air. The military was not just entering the city. They were launching a bombing run, a desperate attempt to stem the tide of the undead horde. Fear and uncertainty gripped us as we raced through the ruins, our footsteps echoing our desperation. Mark's expression was a mixture of determination and despair as we reached a vantage point overlooking the city. The skyline was lit by the fiery descent of bombs, the destructive force of humanity's last-ditch effort to reclaim the city. As we watched in horror, the ground trembled beneath us, and a deafening roar filled the air. The bombing run was underway, and the city was being consumed by destruction. The undead horde was caught in the chaos, their figures engulfed by the flames that swept through the streets. Mark stood on the edge of the building, his eyes fixed on the devastation below. The city that had once been a symbol of life and progress was now a wasteland of destruction. The military's intervention was a desperate measure, a reminder that survival came at a staggering cost. And then, as the smoke and fire began to clear, a glimmer of hope emerged. The undead horde had been significantly weakened by the bombing. Their relentless advance finally halted. The city's streets were littered with the remains of the fallen, and the survivors who had managed to endure were emerging from their hiding places. As the smoke cleared, Mark turned to face us, his expression a mixture of determination and resolve. The military was entering the city, and the battle against the undead was far from over. But amidst the destruction and chaos, a new chapter had begun, a chapter of defiance, unity, and the unwavering will to reclaim a world consumed by darkness. The city was in chaos. The bombing run had left a trail of destruction in its wake, decimating entire blocks and sending plumes of smoke billowing into the sky. The survivors had retreated to their refuge, shaken by the catastrophic events they had witnessed. The military's intervention had halted the advance of the undead, but it had come at a staggering cost. As we gathered in the apartment, the mood was somber. The windows were shattered, and the cold wind seeped into the room, a harsh reminder of the world outside. Mark's gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the remnants of the bombing run still smoldered. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice filled with determination. "The city is in ruins, and the military won't be able to secure it completely. We need to find a safer place, somewhere we can regroup and rebuild." Jack nodded in agreement, his expression reflecting the weight of the decision. "We can't rely on the military to save us," he added. "We need to take our fate into our own hands." The survivors knew that their journey was far from over. The city had become a battleground, and the undead still roamed its streets. With newfound resolve, we set out on a perilous journey to find a sanctuary, a place where we could rebuild our lives in the midst of the apocalypse. The streets were littered with debris. The aftermath of the bombing run a stark testament to the desperation of humanity's last stand. The city's once thriving neighborhoods were now desolate, and the survivors moved cautiously through the ruins, their senses alert for any sign of danger. As we ventured deeper into the city, the presence of the undead remained a constant threat. The survivors moved silently, their weapons at the ready, as they navigated through the decaying landscape. Every alleyway turned, every building entered, was a potential danger. A reminder that the undead could emerge from the shadows at any moment. Hours turned into days as we pressed forward, determined to find a place of refuge. Our group had become a tightly knit unit, each member watching the other's back as we faced the unknown together. The bonds that had formed through hardship were unbreakable, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Finally, we reached a fortified compound on the outskirts of the city. It was a former military installation, its walls still standing strong amidst the chaos. The survivors cautiously approached, their weapons at the ready, but the compound appeared to be deserted. With a sense of hope, we entered the compound and began the process of securing it as our new refuge. The military had left behind supplies and equipment, a valuable resource that would aid in our survival. The survivors worked tirelessly, fortifying the walls and creating a safe haven in the midst of the apocalypse. As the days turned into weeks, a semblance of normalcy began to return to our lives. The compound became our home, a place where we could find safety and respite from the relentless nightmare outside. But the survivors knew that they could never truly let their guard down. The world had changed, and the battle for survival would continue. One evening, as the survivors gathered around a flickering fire, Mark stood before them, his voice filled with conviction. "We've come a long way," he said, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the group. "But our journey is far from over. We must remain vigilant, for the undead still roam the city, and the world beyond is a harsh and unforgiving place." With a shared sense of purpose, the survivors nodded in agreement. The compound was their sanctuary, a place where they could rebuild their lives and prepare for the challenges that lay ahead. The world had descended into darkness, but amidst the ruins, a flicker of hope remained. The unwavering spirit of humanity, determined to endure, to survive, and to reclaim a future from the ashes of the past. Life within the fortified compound had become a semblance of stability in the chaos that engulfed the outside world. The survivors had established routines, assigned duties, and even managed to create a sense of community amidst the apocalyptic landscape. But as the days turned into weeks, a new and ominous threat began to emerge. The undead were evolving. It began with sightings of running variants. These undead were no longer the slow, shuffling horrors that had haunted the city's streets. They moved with surprising speed, their jerky and unnatural gait making them even more terrifying. The survivors encountered them during scavenging runs, their relentless pursuit testing the limits of their endurance. The running variants were a grim reminder that the undead were not a static threat. They were adapting, becoming more dangerous with each passing day. The survivors were forced to rethink their strategies, learning to move more cautiously and silently to avoid detection. But the greatest shock came when reports emerged of smart variants. These undead displayed a level of cunning and intelligence that defied explanation. They set traps, coordinated attacks, and even used rudimentary tools. It was as if some twisted form of intelligence had awakened within them, making them an even more formidable foe. The first encounter with the smart variants was a harrowing experience. During a routine patrol outside the compound, the survivors stumbled upon a group of these creatures. They had set a trap, luring the survivors into an ambush. It was a brutal battle, the survivors barely escaping with their lives. The realization that the undead were evolving into more cunning and agile adversaries sent shockwaves through the compound. Fear and uncertainty hung in the air as the survivors grappled with the new reality. The rules of engagement had changed, and the battle for survival had become even more treacherous. Mark called a meeting of the group, his expression grim. "We can't underestimate these new variants," he warned. "We need to adapt, to stay one step ahead of them. Our survival depends on it." The survivors began to train and prepare for encounters with the evolved undead. They honed their combat skills, developed new tactics, and fortified their defenses. Every decision was made with the understanding that the world outside was a deadly, evolving landscape. As the days passed, the survivors encountered more of the running and smart variants. Each encounter was a deadly test of their wits and determination, a reminder that the undead were a relentless and ever-evolving threat. But amidst the danger and uncertainty, the survivors held on to one truth. They were a resilient and unyielding force. The compound remained their sanctuary, a place where they could regroup and prepare for the challenges that lay ahead. The world had become a terrifying and unpredictable place, but the survivors were determined to face it head-on, to adapt and to endure. The fortified compound had provided a semblance of safety, but as the days turned into weeks, the survivors had grown complacent. The appearance of the running and smart variants had kept them on edge, but the familiar walls and routines had created a false sense of security. One ominous night, as the survivors lay in their makeshift beds, the eerie silence was shattered by a distant moan. It was a sound they had grown all too familiar with, but this time, it held an unsettling intensity. The alert was raised, and the compound came to life with urgency. The survivors rushed to their positions, their hearts racing with fear. They could feel it in the air. This was no ordinary attack. The undead had amassed in unprecedented numbers, encircling the compound, their hollow eyes gleaming with hunger. Panic spread like wildfire as the survivors realized the gravity of the situation. The compound's defenses were strong, but the sheer volume of the undead horde threatened to overwhelm them. It was a nightmarish scenario, a desperate battle for survival against insurmountable odds. As the first wave of undead crashed against the compound's defenses, the night was filled with chaos. Gunfire erupted, and the metallic clang of weapons striking undead flesh echoed through the compound. The survivors fought with a ferocity born of desperation, their backs against the walls of their once safe haven. In the midst of the turmoil, Jack, their unwavering leader, emerged as a beacon of strength. His voice cut through the cacophony, directing the survivors' efforts as they fought to hold back the relentless horde. But in the chaos of battle, tragedy struck. A running variant, its movements swift and erratic, lunged at Jack with unnatural speed. Its jagged teeth found purchase on his arm, and he cried out in agony as it sank its rotten jaws into his flesh. The survivors fought desperately to pry the creature off him, but the damage had been done. Jack pushed them away, his face twisted in pain. "Go!" he yelled, his voice a raw plea. "Save yourselves!" Tears welled in their eyes as they watched Jack's face contort in agony. He had been bitten, and there was no saving him. It was a gut-wrenching decision, but they knew they had to leave him behind, his cries of pain haunting them as they retreated. The compound was no longer defensible, overrun by the relentless undead. The survivors fought their way through the horde, the weight of their loss heavy on their shoulders. Jack's sacrifice had bought them precious seconds, but the undead showed no signs of relenting. As they emerged from the compound, the night was still filled with danger. The city was a labyrinth of shadows and death, and their journey was far from over. Jack's memory burned in their hearts, a testament to his unwavering leadership and sacrifice. The survivors pressed on, their resolve unshaken despite the crushing weight of uncertainty. The world had become a relentless nightmare, where the dead refused to stay buried and the living fought for every breath. But amidst the darkness and despair, a glimmer of hope remained. The survivors were united by their shared determination, ready to honor Jack's sacrifice and face whatever horrors the world had yet to unleash. The city, once a bustling metropolis, had become a nightmarish labyrinth of death and decay. The survivors, their numbers reduced by tragedy, had no choice but to abandon the fortified compound that had briefly been their refuge. The relentless undead horde had claimed their sanctuary, and now they faced the daunting task of escaping the city. With heavy hearts and a determination forged in the crucible of adversity, the survivors set out into the unknown. The streets were eerily quiet, the remnants of destruction and death bearing witness to the horrors that had unfolded. The city's skyline, once a symbol of pride and achievement, loomed as a haunting reminder of the world they had lost. Their journey was treacherous, every step fraught with danger. The running and smart variants still roamed the streets, and the survivors moved cautiously, their senses alert for any sign of movement. Every corner turned, every alley crossed, held the potential for deadly ambush. The group had become a tightly knit unit, their trust in one another unwavering. Each member watched the other's backs, their shared determination pushing them forward through the abyss. They had lost friends and family, but their will to survive burned brighter than ever. As they ventured deeper into the city, they encountered pockets of survivors who had managed to endure, each group sharing stories of tragedy and triumph. The survivors offered help and supplies, their bonds strengthened by the common struggle against the undead. But danger still lurked around every corner. The survivors faced countless close calls and harrowing encounters as they navigated the treacherous terrain. The city had become a relentless battleground, where the line between life and death grew thinner with each passing day. The journey felt like an eternity, the city's dark heart seemingly endless. But as they pressed forward, the landscape began to change. The undead grew fewer in number, their relentless pursuit waning. It was as if the city itself had given up its relentless grip on the survivors. Finally, they reached the outskirts, where the city's chaos gave way to a desolate calm. The survivors paused, their breaths visible in the cold air, as they gazed back at the city that had been their crucible of survival. It was a place of unspeakable horrors, but it had also forged them into an unbreakable force. With a shared sense of purpose, the survivors turned their backs on the city and ventured into the unknown. The world outside was a harsh and unforgiving place, but they carried with them the lessons learned in the crucible of the apocalypse. They were united by their determination to survive, to honor the sacrifices of those they had lost, and to carve a future from the remnants of a shattered world. The city's skyline faded into the distance as the survivors walked forward, their steps echoing with the resolve to endure, no matter the challenges that lay ahead. The road was long and uncertain, but they were determined to face it together, their spirits unbroken in a world forever changed.